Hello and welcome to Around the Lens Reviews, our
Hello.
semi-monthly, quarterly, whenever series where Zach and I get together and talk about a movie, specifically a movie that has to do with visual journalism. Of course, I'm doing it with my co-host, Zach. Zach, hello.
Hello, how goes it?
Good, buddy. How are you?
I'm alive. I'm alive.
Good to hear. Good to hear. I see you're in a new area of your house.
Yeah,
Always
literally
exciting to
just
see.
turned everything around.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
Well, good, good. Change is good. Like we'll be having changes on the show, the main show soon. This is on the eve of our big 100 episode, big 2-year anniversary episode. So if you're watching this live, which would be like, I don't know how you would find out unless you're a subscriber, but if you're watching it live, then know that we'll be doing that show tomorrow.
Yeah.
But what we're doing here in this review is we're reviewing a film by the name of Hookah Hey, which is a documentary about war photographer Jason P. Howe. Now, the full title of Hookah Hey or the movie is called Hookah Hey, A Good Day to Die. And the basic gist of it is that it follows the life of self-taught documentary photographer and war photographer Jason P. Howe, and kind of talks about his life, starting with his documentation of the conflict in Colombia in 2001, and kind of hits the high point of his 12-year career that includes documentation of, again, 4 wars, that in Colombia, Iraq, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. Yep. The film is created by Monfils Pictures. And let's see, who's the director? I'm looking for the director's name here.
It is Harold Monfils.
Yes, of course, in the Monfils production. So Harold put this film together, and it includes interviews with Jason as well as other war photographers. One you might know of, who's been on the show before, is Eros Hoagland. He was on our show way back in the early single-digit episodes. And he's featured on this film, as well as a number of other well-known war photographers. But both Zach and I saw this 90-minute film, and we're here to talk about our impressions of it. So I think I've spoken enough. So I'm going to throw it to you, Zach, and you can speak a little bit and talk about what you thought of the film first.
I think it's a solid, solidly put together documentary, just on the technical aspects and stuff like that. It has a lot of fantastic kind of not really behind the scenes clips of documentary of photojournalism, like from battles and stuff like that. But things that you I'd kind of be doubtful that were ever used before, just like kind of the video clips that if you have a camera nowadays that shoots video and still, you might turn on video and then record a little bit and then switch back when you're taking stills. So there's a lot of that. It has a little bit of a I've talked about this HBO series a lot. Witness has a lot of that feel to it, where it's like kind of it'll use photos from the scene along with video clips, kind of hand in hand and together. And like I said, both of those, like Witness is fantastic. This is overall really fantastic film, and just especially it might be a little bit inside baseball for people outside of the photojournalism world, but I think in a lot of the ways that like Restrepo and I'm blanking on his other film that he did. I think that this is a really good film if people are trying to either think about getting into the field, or also people who, because photojournalism, we're a very kind of closed off bunch of people, and either we're portrayed as monsters, paparazzi or whatever, which again, this is a lot of things that are discussed in this film. Eros Hoagland has has a good amount of screen time in it, and I think that you'll see a lot of conversations that he had with us that are very familiar. This is likely filmed around the same time, or at least his interviews were likely filmed around the same time. I think that we interviewed him about his kind of consideration of what what photojournalism is and where it's going. So it's a really good tie-in to Around the Lens.
That's right. I don't know why we didn't get credit. I read all those credits. I didn't see Around the Lens mentioned. But yeah, you know, in terms of, if you listen to the show that features Eros and you watch this film, you're going to see a lot of parallels between the comments and thoughts that he expresses in the film about the overall, you know, war photographer career field or whatnot, or the way he interprets it, and kind of you'll see that expressed in this film when you watch it. From a general perspective, I thought the film was very well done. I will say that, you know, full disclosure, I didn't sort of arrange for the for our being able to review this film. That was all you. I just sort of jumped in and, you know, wanted to watch it, and I knew it was about visual journalism, and I knew it was about sort of related to war photography. Yeah. But I really didn't know anything about it beyond that. I didn't know it was about Jason Howe, so I kind of came into it completely blank, like, you know, just kind of seeing the name, seeing the poster, and walking into the theater type of blank, you know. And I was a little bit sort of confused at first because I didn't know if this was about one person or if it was about war photography in general. Yeah. And the overall structure of the film with regard to the timeline and narrative and kind of how it jumps around at first kind of took me by surprise and kind of made me a little bit like confused. But I think once I got sort of figured it out and kind of understood what the whole subject matter was about, I really started to like ease into it and started to really get a lot out of it and enjoy it. So that first sort of half hour, I was like, what's going on here? Yeah. But after that, I really thought it was a really well done piece. And I think if you have any interest or want to understand what war photography is like, or, you know, what it's like to be a photographer in a conflict zone, then I think this is sort of the key, you know, in terms of, it epitomizes everything that you would want to see in a film about this sort of subject matter. Yeah. Like, it gives you that as raw feeling and perspective as you can get without being there yourself. Yeah.
I really like how, because they also, it's not just photojournalists that are in the film, it's also just standard journalists. Right. I was never know how to separate. We're like writers that would be assigned along with the photographers, and kind of giving their very honest reactions to Jason, like entering a new scene, because he kind of starts out in Colombia. That's his first with the FARC conflict. That's his first scene, and then goes to, I think it was Afghanistan was the next fight that he went to, right?
Well, I believe it opens in Iraq.
Yeah, but no, I'm just saying in his personal timeline, because that's also part of what this film is about, is kind of his evolution as a photojournalist, and learning it, because like you said at the opening, he's self-taught, right? And that's something that's very interesting too, is that I think it was Eros who mentioned, you know, kind of very critical of, maybe it wasn't Eros, it was maybe one of the other ones that mentioned it was very critical of photojournalism school, that they're kind of pushing you know, young kids who aren't really ready to go into combat photography, like during college, you know, like whether it be an internship or whatever. I mean, it's kind of that this is the way that, to an extent, the other writer, the writer saw Jason when he went to, like I said, I believe it was Afghanistan. I forget if it was Afghanistan or Iraq. But as said, he wasn't ready, in the fact that, like, he treated it more like a scene. He didn't know to jump, like the professionalization of jumping from, you can be a certain way when you're hanging out with FARC rebels that you can't be when you're hanging out with Afghan soldiers or things like that. Just culturally, it's a little bit different. And so it was kind of interesting to see an evolution, because usually you don't, either you have in film, if a photojournalist is actually pictured in a document or in an actual movie, either you have the completely green kid who is way over his head, or you have like the seasoned, you know, hard photojournalist who, you know, has scars mentally and physically, and there's no in between. There's no, like, a guy who has a little bit of experience, and kind of, you don't ever get to see that evolution in a film. I mean, really, other than maybe Bang Bang Club, which unfortunately the film didn't really do a good job of it. The book did an excellent job of kind of talking about the evolution that you have. But that's something that this film does I think really, really well through the kind of the very casual interviews that they have. They don't seem like very specifically like pre-formatted in the way that you have like a 60 Minutes documentary you might have. Like, these seem to be conversations that they're pulling clips from, which I personally, as a filmmaker, I really, really dig when filmmakers are able to do that.
Yeah, I think overall the interviewing of the subjects and the subject matter was very well done. Obviously beautiful to look at. Looks like they shot it with a Red or some other high-end camera with a good low depth of field. And the way they intersplice the comments and really build the story, because the story is ultimately their interviews, right? They have to build the whole narrative story out of the interviews. And Jason is the thread, that goes through the whole thing. But obviously his story is helped out and magnified by all the people who help, tell that story as well. So I think, to have nothing but talking heads and mixed in with, some random still frames, really made for a captivating overall story that I thought was definitely watchable, and it kept my interest for almost the entire time. And the way they did a little bit of post-processing and special effects on the photographs as well. Yeah. Just to kind of give you, because they knew all they were going to show you were still frames. Yeah. So they had to give a little bit of motion, and some
a little bit of the Ken Burns type thing, a little bit, but
well, even beyond, I mean, that's what they did with the manipulation of the image to kind of like stretch and format it. That's not something Ken Burns does.
The first time I ever saw that, and they did a little bit here, but if you ever want to see it done shockingly, amazingly well, especially considering for a film that's I think a decade's old. At least it's a documentary called "The Kid Stays in the Picture," and it's a great kind of Hollywood, a film about Hollywood history, and the producer who was behind, I think The Godfather and a couple other films, and I'm blanking on his name right now. But they are able to use the pictures and like move through them, which is something that I don't think that After Effects existed when that happened. So I don't even know how they did that at least technically, but they do that to a small extent in this film. I wish they did a little bit more. I think that'd be nice, but having done that, I've literally done one photo like that in my life, and it took me all day to do one image. I've seen some people do it very well. Anyone who even tries doing it, but
I saw a tutorial about somebody who did it, and he was a master at it. He could take and move foreground objects, background objects, the background, everything, and make almost like a full picture out of a photograph. Yeah. I don't see it to that extent in here. It was just nice to see a little bit of that, just kind of liven things up. For the most part, I think they're using primarily photographs from Jason, but some shots and video were taken from both Eros and other folks who were documenting Jason. So there's, and we're going to, just so everybody knows, like both Jack and I like the movie. We highly recommend you go watch it. I think there are places out there you can watch it online. If it's not, has not had its theatrical release yet, go watch it so that we can you can come back to the show at this point and kind of talk. We're going to start talking about more in
minor spoilery.
It's
not
spoilery.
There's no, it's not like it's not like we're gonna give up what Rosebud actually was or something like that. So
yeah, we can't tell you who the real killer is.
But to be a little bit spoilery itself, like it's not that type of film where there's everybody dies in the end. Even though there is a for me as well, where I had the moment I'm like, wait, forgot if everybody's still around. But yeah, if you want to see it completely and totally free, then certainly go check, turn off right now and come back later. But honestly, you don't really need to.
Yeah, it's a biography. It's a biographical story about these people. But if you want to go into it clean, like I did, like I said, come back, watch it, and come back at this point in the video. So let's explore the film and sort of the elements and the topics it brings up in more detail. I want to go back to what you said about their discussion of visual journalism school or photojournalism school, and how it was essentially, people were being taught to, people were coming out. I kind of have some mixed feelings about that overall sentiment. Like, I get what they're saying, and I can see how the oversaturation of the career field in that particular area, like you have all these, how do you say, war photography tourists coming out to try and, you know, document some of this stuff and anguish and stuff. But that's all generated because of them. You know, they're the reason that happened. You have, you know, if you have a 12-year career and you're producing work in the beginning of your career that's, you know, being world renowned and being recognized, whether it be Eros or Jason or whoever, it's going to find its way to the schools, and they're going to teach their students about what you're doing. So it's like you're your own worst enemy in that regard, because, you know, these people are going through school, getting inspired by what you did and wanting to go out there and document the same thing and kind of, you know, get that same stuff.
I mean, one of the things that they kind of distinctly say is that, like, green and untrained, and that's, I think, really, really important difference, is that I know a lot of photojournalists who right out while they were still in PJ school or were right out of it, went to Baghdad, went to whatever, but they went through they went through risk training. They went through risk training. They had military background. They had a better idea of the language. They planned in the way that, you know, I definitely have to have a fixer, and they had a lot of times they had a publication backing them too. It wasn't just like going freelance. I mean, there's a reason why I haven't gone to a lot of different conflicts is, well, never mind I don't have a publication that would back me, but I don't feel in any way, shape, and form that I would be prepared to go to Syria or go to Yemen or if I could even get into Yemen, or go to a lot of these locations. Even going to Euromaidan was a really, really risky situation for a person. Not necessarily.
What's Euromaidan?
Was Euromaidan, Ukraine, Kiev, the conflict back then, and, you know, I mean, like, literally, I'm on the plane and, you know, driving down to the airport and down to New York and hearing about snipers being shot. And I'm like, well, I don't have a ballistic helmet. I do have a bulletproof vest. And, you know, I mean, and I don't have risk, you know, I mean, luckily I was going with CS, who has, you know, military training. And I think he's at least done at that point, he might've done some like level of, you know, risk style training. But risk, by the way, is, if you don't know, is I forget what it stands for, but basically it's a training program that photojournalists or journalists can go through to get kind of basic medical training, and also kind of just the things that you should do in a combat zone, kind of things that you know combat military people are trained in, but you're getting kind of the very brief, you know, breakdown. And then kind of, I think it does some ethical type things as well. But like I said, I haven't unfortunately gone yet. Still waiting for that full scholarship. I got offered a half scholarship before, but still couldn't afford it. So, but yeah.
Trying to find out what RISC stands for. It's RISC, and it means I don't know.
I'm not even sure.
Look it up. RISC, they have a Facebook page, RISC training. Yeah, you deal with casualties, you deal with all kinds of different scenarios, and they do have a scholarship or a program of some kind. But you know what I was trying to say was, you know, it's like they kind of like lament the
reporters instructed in saving colleagues.
What's that?
Reporters instructed in saving colleagues.
Great.
That's risk.
There you go. Get the training if you can, but
yeah, you can go risctraining.org. That's the website. So.
Sweet. Yep. But no, I was saying is just I was kind of like, I didn't buy the whole idea that, you know, they're sort of lamenting this insurgence of, you know, overabundance of photographers, right? He's talking about how people are getting there. And just swarming the scene, and they aren't respecting the folks out there. And I'm like, that's a you know, just the nature of the beast, you know, with regard to the overabundance of photographers in every aspect of the career field, whether it's wedding, you know, whether it's
but you don't have a scene where you have 200 professional photojournalists jumping the bride. You may have guys with cell phones or something like that, but you don't have. I mean, this is a problem that I had in Charlottesville, and I forget whether we've talked about it recently on the show or whether actually it was just, you know, chatting with colleagues. But and I think that the photojournalism school conversation and this conversation are slightly, they kind of weaved into each other, but it's slightly different, in so much as that has, unfortunately, it doesn't have anything to do with training. That has to do with a level of like respect and kind of personal ethics that I feel like a lot of photojournalists are kind of losing. Whether that has to do with, you know, the increased amount of competition, I don't know. But this kind of obsession to get closer and closer and closer and closer to the point that you're shoving a camera in the face of a child that's bleeding, you know, and things like that, as opposed to shooting with a telephoto, or as opposed to getting that different shot. And
well, like they said, it's that paparazzi effect that's now occurring in war photography. And you know, paparazzi, I can tell you right now, it's a overabundance of people in the same place trying to all, you know, one up themselves or trying to get that exclusive shot. And yeah, you get closer and closer because you were trying to get a shot somebody else doesn't have, or you're trying to get in somebody else's way. And so I thought it was kind of funny that he mentioned that part where somebody had messed with his camera gear and you know, turned the stops up 3 times to get, you know, force him to have his imagery overexposed. That's an interesting technique. That is, I never heard about people doing that before, but that's, I guess,
that sounds like a exclusively that is the description to me of paparazzi, where to me the paparazzi kind of thing only comes in when you're actually trying to interact with the subject and you're trying to goad them into something, and your presence is causing the scene to be different. You can get really close to a subject, and you can really get in someone's, not necessarily in someone's face in a bad way, but like in their kind of personal space without being paparazzi. I've gotten photos of both, you know, protesters and obviously very different combat scene or whatever. But even in Charlottesville, where you had an active, in my consideration, terrorist you know, event happen and people are injured lying on the street, I got extraordinarily close to people and I slowly worked my way up to it. And I didn't necessarily say, hey, do you mind if I take your photo? But I did, you know, if you've ever, you know, if you're in public and if you care about whether or not the person cares if you're going to take a photo, there's a kind of a nonverbal way that you can have someone kind of agree to have a photo. You be really transparent about it and take their photo and then get the hell out, which is to me the big difference between paparazzi and doing that kind of work, is that you get your image and you get away. Paparazzi keep on taking more and more images and don't get away, don't get out of, you know, the subject's faces. And I see that all the time now in photojournalism circles, where it's just, they just keep taking photos until the subject that they're trying to take photos, it does something aggressive. And then they keep taking photos because now they have a different scene. And the way that Eros talked about, because Eros was talking about that one specifically, because he also talks about that in the Witness documentary as well. He, you know, about getting in people's faces. And in fact, he gets called out on it within the first episode of the Witness series, specifically because, you know, he actually says he knows, you know, he said this, I think he said this in by the way, it's episode 6 of our show. We have Eros on. You know, he talks about when his father died, and his father was John Hoagland, one of the best photojournalists working in Central America during the 80s, covering the Contras and everything like that. And he, of course, all the photojournalists showed up and to cover his father's funeral because it was big news. And, you know, he personally went through that to a kind of a different extent, I think, than a lot of an active combat scene. You know, if he was literally there with his father, you know, after his father had been killed on that scene in Central America, then it would be a very different story. But still, like, he talks about how he went through it. And I think that probably has deeply changed the way that he looks at photojournalism than, you know, and doing it for a couple of years and getting yelled at by people who just had a loved one get shot. And that may have, I'm obviously reading more into it. I'm sure we could have Eros on sometime and talk to him about it. But I also feel like he's kind of literally talked about it enough at this point. So wouldn't want to ask him anymore. But, you know, I think that's I think that he makes an excellent point in that, and I think that all photojournalists should really, really start considering more and more, especially America, even in America now, where we have more and more scenes where it's a lot like, you know, combat, you know, whether it be Texas, whether it be Charlottesville, you know, we have mass shootings on pretty much a regular now, where we're dealing with people who literally just lost their entire family, or like, you know, 10% of their town, like in Texas. And, you know, we need to kind of start having that discussion as a field. But
well, like, you know, the problem is, and this has happened to paparazzi, it happens to all the career fields when they start getting people who don't have experience in it, right? So I can tell you, you know, from my personal experience, is that paparazzi don't want to get up on, you know, they don't want to use a wide angle lens on their subject. They don't want to impact the scene. They want to treat covering celebrities almost like nature photography, right? And for the most part, their ideal situation.
I would differ that they're not paparazzi. Then I would differ that they're celebrity photographers or entertainment photographers, not paparazzi.
It's the same. It's the same difference. I'm an
entertainment photographer. I don't commit paparazzi. You know.
So let's talk about that. That could be a whole other subject for a whole other show.
I know.
I want to say though, paparazzi, the name has sort of been, I would say that the term has been abused by the people who do it poorly. But when it was originally sort of started back in the 90s, sort of it came into vogue. The idea was that you can you shoot your celebrity with like a 300mm lens, and you're not trying to manipulate the scene. You're just trying to get a shot of them maybe eating lunch or walking on the street. Really, it's the biggest sellers with regard to paparazzi aren't necessarily the ones where they're doing something wrong. It's just trying to showcase a photograph of them wearing some, you know, nice outfit, and, you know, the fashion mags love that, or carrying a purse, and you know, they can talk about, oh, look, Kate Beckinsale has a new purse, and you know, but what happens is you have an integration, you have an overabundance of people who are all desperate to get the shot. You have people who aren't trained to get the shot, who aren't trained how to do it, and so they get closer and closer. They don't respect the rights of the people who are, you know, or not the rights, but I mean, they don't respect the space of the people. And that's what happened to the combat photography, at least with regard to the conflict zone issues that are mentioned in this film, I think, is that, you know, you get people who don't have the training, who don't have respect for the subject matter, who are all to get the shots because they try to make money, because they're trying to put food on the plate. And so they get up close to the subject matter and they shoot it with the wide angle lens, and then it becomes a mob on a scene. Whereas, like, you know, if we could all just agree to go back and put our long glass, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But again, you have everybody trying to one up the other person. And again, it's interesting, this actually, now I think about it, the parallels between conflict photography and paparazzi. And one of the things that sort of, when I worked as that field, you know, one of the things that my boss looked for in paparazzi photographers was military photographers, because paparazzi is a lot of waiting around for nothing and then a huge burst in quick action of something, right? So that's very similar to what you see in conflict zone and war type photography, is that you're with if you're embedded with a group or a troop, you know, there's a lot of times when nothing's going on, and then you have intense action when there's like a firefight. So that's all I want to really say about that. Again, we can have a whole other, we'll probably have a show we'll have a discussion on the show about Around the Lens. But going back to the film, you know, I thought it was interesting, you know, again, how he wasn't a trained photographer, but he shot some very beautiful and, you know, images. And what was said during the film, where it's like his career sort of started, like the best of his career started at the beginning of his career, you know, with regard to getting the shots of the dead outside the bus explosion. I thought that was pretty interesting. And I don't, do you agree that kind of like that's where his sort of the best of his career happened? Or do you think, you know, like you saw, obviously he evolved as a photographer.
His agent, I mean, his agent brought up that point, is that kind of the, you know, that was the, I don't think when he said kind of the peak of his career, I don't think he meant it as in like his best work necessarily, but like the pinnacle moment, the defining moment of his career was within, you know, the first year or so of his career, which, you know, there's a lot of photojournalists who do that. They get their, you know, first year, they win a Pulitzer, and then they spend the next 30 years of their life kind of just doing photojournalism, which, you know, which is, I guess, you know, which is, I can't imagine how, you know, I can't imagine how that's got to be. It's got to be really rough. But on the other
Well, a
hand,
few other careers I think can kind of reflect that same sort of career path, you know, where it's like for photojournalism, where you can get a shot that can be once in a million.
Yeah.
And it can happen at the first day of your job or the last day of your job or anywhere in between. And you could be like, you know, exalted. And I think it's interesting to see how
you think about that. You think about that journalist, photojournalist from the Daily Progress in Charlottesville, got the that photo of the guy flying off the back of the car that was driving through the crowd and everything like that. That was his last assignment, his last day as a photojournalist, and he was taking a job going somewhere else outside of the field. And jeez. But I mean, that literally, it was 2 years ago or last year that he had another. He had at least I think it was one or two other one photojournalist, another journalist who also, by the time that they won the Pulitzer and went onto the stage, they had left the field and gone into one. I think one went into press relations, and another went on to just do a different thing and leave photojournalism. And so, but he stuck around for 12 years, but and has for good or for bad has the effects of it, which I mean, I think one thing that this does really well too is that we continually talk about. I mean, we've done an episode or two about PTSD and about kind of the effects, but it's continually talked about in for the military, but it's not, I think, in general talked about when it comes to the press and the media that cover it, outside of kind of insular, like outside of podcast roundtables with photojournalists. It's not really talked about that much. But this film and kind of everyone in it, from Eros to I forgot the other photographer's name, but they all discuss on kind of how it affected them long term, and how it affected Jason, and how they saw him change, and how. And I think, and it's interesting considering, I don't know if I think Hector Emanuel is still working, but Eros has left photojournalists. Jason Howe has left photojournalism, and so out of everyone in this film, I have to Google whether he's still working, but like you have two of the main people in this film have left the field that they're talking about, and that's and not after. I mean. 12 years is not, I've done 12 years of photojournalism. I mean, obviously not that type of work.
Slightly different.
Yeah. No, but it's not, I don't feel, I'm not talking about it in that way. I'm talking about it in the way that, like, I don't feel that I'm that crazy far into my career. I feel like, I hope at least I got at least another 20 years of doing this. My body kind of tells me otherwise. The shooting pains in my right arm from carpal tunnel and holding a bag and everything tell me differently. But it is interesting that this far in that they chose to leave. And I do wonder if that's, for Eros, I know a lot of that I think was, knowing his father and what he went through, and having that really closeness of other photojournalists who knew his father kind of talked to him. I think he kind of knew to get out before he was too far in. I also think he got married and had a kid. That obviously has a deep effect on choosing whether you're going to throw yourself into combat. But with Jason, it seemed to be just a very conscious choice of he was the only way he could find dealing with everything that he had gone through was partying and booze and drugs and everything. And I don't know if I see that as I'm taking a drink of my Jameson.
I thought this film did a great job exploring the PTSD aspect of the career field. And like I said, we did, like you said, we did talk about it as a subject, but I think seeing it here visually represented in the way they did, very much striking and showcases that these people are just as affected by it. And I think in general we don't talk about PTSD experienced by civilians, whether nobody's talking about the PTSD that probably the survivors of the church shooting are probably going to have to experience for the rest of their lives, or same thing for Charleston or Vegas. I mean, yes, it's primarily commonly understood and referred to as something that happens to the military, but it can happen to anyone from anything almost. And, these type of experiences, and the way he described it as being, nightmares he experienced or other things like that and whatnot is totally understandable considering what he's experienced over his 12 years and what he's seen firsthand. I mean, the death of his girlfriend, and that must have been, that was hugely impactful towards him. And then all the different war zones he was a part of. I mean, it's not easy to get into. I don't blame him for leaving after 12 years, Yeah. It's like, it's one of these young person professions, It's like people go in young when they think they're invincible and then they get burnt out pretty quickly. Yeah. I mean, I don't know any other war photographers who've done this, up until like their entire careers. I mean, besides obviously some people, some names, I can't think of their names off the top of my head, but I know there are people who've done it, their entire careers.
Well, like I think it's different. Most of the kind of older guys in the field don't do it. Kind of in the way that Eros and the way that Jason did, in spending weeks and months there, like the ones that I know now. And obviously these are guys mostly in their 60s, so understandably they don't go to Baghdad and cover the combat, like on a daily basis, but they'll go for a shorter amount of time. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, there's one scene that, and this is kind of taking us off subject, but there's one scene that I wanted to make sure that we talked about was the spider hole scene. Oh yeah. If you remember, like, to me, that was a very interesting conversation. So and by the way, it was Iraq that he went to after Colombia. I literally just looked at my notes, but
right. Afghanistan was his last tour.
Yeah, he was in Iraq, and there was a spider hole that all these photojournalists were taking photos of, and he was the only one he decided to just jump in, which was kind of a note like they used to discuss about how he was different and how he just kind of didn't know what kind of it was to act as a photojournalist, in which you wouldn't necessarily jump into something like a spider hole, I guess, with a flashlight and a camera. And how he just saw all the other photojournalists just taking photos. He's like, I don't know how many other ways you can take a photo of this, like a hole in the ground. And then they show a couple of the photos from other photojournalists. And he's like, until I saw later on how creative, how different people were taking photos of it, which I find is something that I've noticed in my own career, where I will try to do something completely different, just jump up on a curb or leave, shoot in a different way, because I see everyone jumping around and what I think taking the same boring image of some person or whatever. And then you see the photos a week later and you're like, oh, wow, maybe these guys are just sometimes better than me. Like, they're more creative and they have, they had a different eye on seeing something. And like, to me, that was, especially for photojournalists who cover things with a lot of other photographers right next to them, that was a very telling scene that I think most photographers would kind of, they have some moment in their life where they're like, what the hell? Why is everybody taking the same photo of the same thing? And then you look at 12 different images and they're all different. And you're like, oh, that's why.
Yeah, it's something I try to, imbue upon the people who work for me, who are photojournalists, is saying, like, you got to take the mundane and make it, look extraordinary. You have to be able to do that if you want to be a great photojournalist. You're not going to always have the most exciting content, thrust upon you. Yeah. You have to sometimes you get a hole in the ground, sometimes you get a beautiful sunset, but it's like you got to make each and every one of them, each image of that shine, because ultimately, well, with this instance, you're competing with 200 other people who are also taking the hole in the ground. So how do you, with that, you have to actually think, like, how do I make this look different? Yeah. And like I said, there were people who, knew this, understood it, and perhaps could, step away from the situation, walk around and like think, okay, where aren't people covering this from? What moments can I get out of this scene that aren't being, the traditional ones that everyone are seeing? And, that's something you get from, years of experience doing the job, or at least just having, some sort of built-in wherewithal about yourself that, like, okay, I can shoot this, like anything, shoot it traditionally, shoot it normally, get the shot you need to get, and then think about how you can shoot, other shots that correlate to it and can help support, but are different. Did you like the whole Columbia sort of love story thing that they talked about? Was that interesting to you?
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it again shows his kind of evolution as a journalist, and kind of, you know, I think that most journalists would kind of look at that with a big question mark if you know, basically found a person who was the subject of your story and then essentially started kind of dating them, and then, you know, it sounds very, I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't been made into some sort of film yet, because it's very, it's such a it's such a story. It's like one of the, it's the kind of only way that you have photojournalists. It reminds me of the film Salvador a little bit, because kind of the same thing happens where he kind of falls in love. Unfortunately, James Woods, we can't like that film anymore, but sorry.
Did James Wood get accused of some sexual misconduct?
Yes, actually,
I haven't been following it. There's been so many. It's like,
no, but James Woods is also just a terrible human being. I think you just need to just go on his Twitter at some point. He's blocked me ages ago, so
which that should be a feather in your cap.
No, it actually it is. But in that film, he falls. It's vaguely based on a true story, vaguely based also on, I believe it's supposed to be Eros's father. I could be wrong. It could be a different one, but that's what I always understood. And but where he falls in love with one of his subjects that he's, you know, photographing with the Civil War that's going on, and then tries to basically save her. But anyway, but I won't go into more spoilers with that. But in the kind of in the same way here, it reminds me of that story. But it also, it's interesting on whether he, and I don't think they really question him that much on it, which is something I might have think, is whether 12 years on into his career, whether he considers that a good choice, even though it was very open. Like there were stories written about his, you know, he was very open about it. So I guess that it's the difference between, like, maybe he took it as a documentary photographer more than, say, a photojournalist, where, you know, to me, there's a slightly different level of ethics, might be the wrong word, but kind of rules and guidelines on whether, you know, interacting with the subjects to that level, you know, interacting to say the least. And but it is, you know, it is. I'd be interested in how much access and everything like that he gained from that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And so there's, you know, there's just a lot of questions with that. But that certainly, I wish that they had spent a little bit more time on it, but I'm also happy that they didn't, because it's such a, you could spend your entire documentary talking about that, and it would probably sell a hell of a lot better than, you know, a bunch of photojournalists talking about photojournalism, because it's, you know, it's a little bit more, it's considerably more sexy. You have a, you know, a freaking assassin as your girlfriend that you're hanging out with in the middle of the FARC. What was going on in Colombia in the what was the early 2000s, and that I'm happy that they didn't spend as much time on it, but I do wish that they kind of had talked about it in a kind of an ethical sort of way a little bit more. I mean, the Eros and what's his colleague's name, Hector, kind of talked about the fact that it was, my word, hinky. But yeah, that's kind of all I have to say on that. But
yeah, you know, my favorite part of the film, and it was a quiet moment, was when they shot it. It was, I believe, the night vision shot, and he's getting kitted up to go out and shoot photos for the day. And you just sort of see him, you know, put on the baklava, put on the body armor, and, you know, put on all the you know, the bags and the packs, and then clip the cameras to the clips that are on his body armor. I love that shot because, you know, it's just seeing that, you know, really brought me back to my own days, you know, wearing the body armor and having the cameras strapped to my body. And also kind of, you know, again, took me back to what our combat camera folks do currently, and sort of how they wear the gear. So for me personally, I could relate to that shot a lot. And I can relate to a lot of the war-based photo stuff, just because, I understand sort of what it is to be in that kind of scenario. So that was my favorite shot of the film. But
I like
overall,
how they mock him after that too. Did you catch that where they were like, he really likes his gear? Because I mean, if you've seen again, I keep referencing this film Witness, but like Eros is the type of guy, like literally he's one of those photographers that doesn't carry a lot of kit. He doesn't carry the gear. He'll carry a bulletproof vest if it's really necessary. But like I don't think in the entire film I once saw an image with him wearing a vest. That might just have to do with the fact it was, it's 115 degrees or whatever in Juarez when he in the scene that they were filming, but still I just enjoy that because there's ones among us. I'm one of those people that way over. The trunk of my car is is a mobile camera store when it comes to certain types of gear. And whether it be gas masks and helmets and bulletproof vest and things like that. So it's something I was reading a review on Amazon or on IMDb of it. It's just a user review. And they described it as a 90-minute indulgence of ego and self-import. And it's interesting reading the review because I can see that to some level, like basically talking about themselves and things like that, because it certainly could come off across that where, and I think that this is one of the big problems that people see in photojournalists, that if we do talk about our work, if we do talk about things, we're not talking about, it's like journalists who become part of the story, other than unless you're Hunter Thompson, it's kind of, you're looked down on if you do that. And so when there are documentaries about whether it be photojournalists or journalists, you really, really kind of walk a thin line on doing that, especially when it's not like big investigative story, like, Woodward and Bernstein or something like that, where like, yeah, no one really died. But here I can certainly see that. But so I may kind of, caveat any, the good review that I say, it's like, it's caveated within the realm of viewers of this podcast, people who want to know more about photojournalism and or are a photojournalist or want to become a photojournalist. But I could see how it seems like that. But again, I don't know. It's kind of like we have documentaries about people in the military. We have documentaries about, people, rescuing people, and usually don't get thrown with like, oh, it's a big ego fest, like how many freaking war films we have about soldiers. And it's like, well, photojournalists are out there too, obviously different, but to me, I think that it's not, to me, I don't read it as a big ego fest. I can see how people perceive it as that way, just talking about themselves, but that's a documentary.
Well, it's a documentary about one person, it's about Jason Howe.
And they're talking about it. Yeah. I think it may have to do with the fact that he's not a household name. And that's one of the problems with most photojournalists. He's not, know how many, I mean, we struggle to think of even,
It will be now after this.
Yeah. Well, but we struggle to even think of, like who are the big names in photojournalism, and I think that's, again, like that's something I always talk about. It's like, I wish that we had more good portrayals of photojournalists and more documentaries or just more movies about photojournalists. Obviously, because I'd love to see more of them because I enjoy them because it's a field that I work in. And, and usually the only time you ever see them is the paparazzi jumping over a fence or doing whatever. But yeah, so.
Do you think this worked better as a exploration of one person, or should have been more of an exploration of multiple people and multiple, like more of not combat photographers, but conflict and war photographers in general, vice one person specifically? Do you think it would have worked better that way?
I think it'd be a different film. I don't know if it would have, if I would say better. I'd like to see that film too. I like, I recognize his photojournalism. So, I recognize Jason's work. But again, I don't know. And this is something I was at the Photo DC thing this past weekend, and they had where my photos were shown. It was also in the same room with the 50th anniversary of the Magnum. Basically just a show of all the Magnum work. And you look at those and you go, I know that photo. Finally you see the name tag and you're like, oh, that's who shot it. And one of the problems is, and this is something, obviously we find on the podcast, is that it's really difficult to get photojournalists to talk about themselves, and talk about the field, because they are so, I think universally I think very much, I say I'm an exception where I really enjoy talking about the field and I really enjoy talking about my work. Yeah. And I know that I come off as probably often as an egotistical asshole or something, but I'm kind of fine with that because I love this field, and I wish that we could get more photojournalists to come, either come on the show or just in general to talk about the field, because I think we're viewed pretty poorly, I think, in general by a lot of the public. And yeah. I've seen that more and more and more while we do work, especially now that we have a lot more what might be described as combat photography happening in the United States. And, through protests and through, covering mass shootings and things like that, especially when they happen in large cities, when photographers are just there. Photojournalists were already at the concert. And so you have people who actually, you don't have like just citizen journalism, you have actual photographers who were there covering it. And so I think it's something that we have to do to kind of save our industry. And something I probably talk about every single damn episode. But we need to talk about ourselves, and we don't get to go on, reporters, they're just as much kind of disliked, but they get to go on and, go on the Rachel Maddow show and get to talk about their work all the time. We never get to do that. Like I did 2 minutes on MSNBC, and I think that's the first time I've ever seen a photojournalist to talking about their work and I watch a lot of watch news basically continually, and you never see anybody do it. And to me, that's completely perplexing, because you literally have the one person who was physically at the scene, because he had to be there. He or she had to physically be there. Why wouldn't you have that person come on?
Yeah, I think it's because most of the time we choose. Yeah, there's a reason we chose to be behind the camera, right? Because we don't want to be in front of the camera, and that's a response I get from a lot of people who I try to either get on the show or take photos of, or have themselves feature themselves. But I would say, for me personally, there's very few stories that I want to hear. Like, I don't want to hear everybody's bios, personal stories. That's why I don't do a interview show with people like about just their bios. Like, I don't want to know how you sort of came into the career field. If you have something specific to say about something specific you've done about something in your career, I'm interested in that. But, to be like, oh, I did this and did this and this is my personal life. There's very few people I want to hear their personal life stories. But, I think, when you can make it interesting like this, and it has to do with such a kinetic, and this guy has such an interesting body of work over the last 12 years, then I think, okay, you get the permission to be focused on. And again, there's very few people in our career field who have super duper interesting stories like him. Would you rather hear about his story and his interesting life, or about some, street photographer who lived in New York City and took photos of people who walk the street? I mean,
I think we're on our 4th or 5th documentary about some street photographer.
I know, right?
Or some fashion photographer or whatever who's honored, beyond belief. And it's like, no, how boring. I just, my thing is that I know what I do. And I have on the scale of photojournalists, I have a relatively boring, maybe not boring, but like not even uneventful necessarily. But, I'm not with, Eros and these guys. And I get why necessarily people don't want to become the story and don't want to talk about themselves. But I mean, I think that most photojournalists have literally, when we all sit around drinks and we start talking about about things and about what we saw and what we do, because, you know, I mean, people talk around especially still photographers. People talk around, if you're at, you know, the convention floor and you're a still photographer, people just don't, they keep talking around you. So you hear stories that people don't, and because we're invited into places that the normal public isn't allowed, we're behind the curtain, you know, right before, you know, Trump comes on stage. You know, we're, you know, hanging out in, you know, at conventions that, you know, and that if you're not, usually aren't allowed, you know, maybe video is not allowed or whatever. So we witness and hear things that the kind of other journalists may not even ever know about. And so, I mean, like, I find this is one of the reasons I love this field so much, is like, I get to see and hear things that almost no one else gets to do, especially people that write, you know, talk about news for a living. And I wish that more of us would tell our stories, you know, and yeah, it would be maybe not even necessarily in a self-indulgent way, but in a just, you know, I was at, you know, give me a photo essay of, you know, I was at the Republican National Convention. Here's what I saw. Here's what I heard, and just write that up. And like that sort of thing. Like I would love. I mean, that's something I'm trying to do with Visa News. So, you know, I am trying to do it. If anybody wants to do it, please, you know, give me a yell. Anyone listening. But I wish that we would do that more. And I wish that, you know, I mean, you think about all the places that's, you know, CNN has videographers and still photographers around, and all these places, all these different news organizations. It's, other than New York Times Lens blog, you don't ever have a conversation about, well, what was it like to photograph? What was it like to see firsthand the after effects of this genocide? And it's so rare that you actually see that. I mean, I think Youngie Kim has talked about it a lot, but it's so often kind of caveated in some other news story or something like that, that we actually discuss the person behind it. It's not even important that the person behind the camera, but it's important that that person was physically there when so many other people weren't. And we have a distinct, we can literally see what we saw, what that person saw. Unlike a writer, you know, a lot of times you have really excellent writers, especially, you know, guys who go to war and write about it. And you can read their stories, but the difference is that I can, you know, if you have Eros or you have anybody else who goes out into combat or goes into, you know, basically a city under siege like Juarez in the early 2000s, and he has photos that he could put along with his words as well to describe what he saw and what he experienced. And you can't do that with writers, you know, like so it takes a really excellent writer will change a story, but it takes one. It doesn't have to be stunning, you know. I mean, you think about the photo, you know, like, again, make it egotistical, but my photo from Charlottesville, it's not an amazing photo technically or image wise or anything like that, quality wise or anything like that, but it literally defined, other than, you know, the killing of Heather Heyer, it was defined that story. It ended up becoming, it's been used like at least 1,000 times now in different publications.
Wow.
And, you know, if I hadn't also talked about it, then it wouldn't, I know for a fact it would not have continued, and it wouldn't continue. If I didn't talk to reporters about it, I know that it would have just gone off the scene. And it's unfortunate that, you know, I'm a bit of an activist, so you know, a little bit, you know, so I know that's why. But if a different photographer had maybe gotten it and didn't want to talk about it, you know, that, I don't know if, you know, you'd have several guys who just beat the living crap out of a 20-year-old teacher who wouldn't be in jail right now. And I don't know, you know, you can talk about whether or not that's something a photojournalist or anybody should do, but I don't know. Anyway.
Well, let's bring it back to the film and basically close off our I guess our comments here with sort of our final thoughts on the overall film. You know, like I said, I thought it was a great film, and I think it gives you an insight into the overall, you know, people, mentality, and experiences that come with being a, wartime or conflict photographer. I hesitate to use the term combat photographer because coming from the military, I see that as sort of a term that I would exclusively more personally apply that to military photographers in a conflict zone or in a war zone. They're real combat photographers, in my opinion, only because not only are they taking pictures in combat, but they're able to respond in combat.
Yeah.
Maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's right.
Yeah, no. It's very bad if a photographer picks up a gun and starts shooting. I mean, that's usually frowned upon.
Actually, it's against Geneva Convention for non-combatant to like go into war like that. That's why even the conflict zone photographers, they can't take weapons with them. They have to be with armed people. So, but anyways, like I said, I think it's a great film. I think you'll get a lot out of it, and stick with it, over the first part. And I think you'll find that it was overall a interesting, rewarding film. The only thing I'd probably say, negatively about it is I think maybe they spent a little bit too much time on the whole Columbia love story thing, but I think it's still a very intriguing and interesting aspect when you understand the role that his girlfriend played in the overall conflict and the fact that he was associated with her. And just that, it does bring up these weird, like, how close to the story am I getting, but yeah, definitely a interesting story of a life lived and lived interestingly. Yeah.
No, I agree on pretty much everything. I mean, I think that as we're, again, as photojournalists, we're a little bit biased on this sort of thing, but yeah, I think that they spent I would say the right amount of time on the love story, just for no other reason than it's such an interesting. I mean, if I was the filmmaker, I'd be like, okay, so this is what I'm making a film about. Like, literally, it would just be that. I would hear that story and just be like, well, nope, that's it. Literally, this is all we're talking about for an hour.
You could probably make a whole movie just out of that.
Yeah, and I honestly now I'm like, I really want to
like
talk
a fictionalized version of
story, like, because that's a crazy story. And you could tell that there's only like little drips of it that he talks about. I mean, like the scene where he says to my girl, you pointed a gun at my head, and he was calmly dealt with it. But that's
not like a scene right out of a movie, like right
there.
Yeah,
exactly. Like that's an interesting relationship, if nothing else. Like that would be a very interesting. But yeah, no, I mean it's quite well shot. It's got a really a great lot of kind of, like I said before, behind the scenes footage.
Beautifully shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could have been done. I think the lighting could have been a little bit better. I'm a really crappy person when it comes to lighting, so I'm not going to criticize too much there. But I think there's certain aspects that could have been shot a little bit better with the interviews. But that's literally, I like when documentaries aren't all about the kind of how gorgeously shot in the bokeh behind this interview is amazing. I'm like, it's an interview where we're supposed to be hearing words. I don't really care too much, but yeah, overall, I mean, I think that this, I'd be interested to see people who, if you have somebody who in your family or close to you that doesn't really care that much about photojournalism, which if you're a photographer, that's kind of sad, but it'd be interesting to have them watch it as well, so that we could, you could hear what somebody who's not kind of inside the field and kind of knows the lingo and everything like that see on it, because I'm interested, based on that IMDb review from somebody who found it very egotistical and such. But I personally loved it. I hope it gets. It looks like it has a British release, UK release, but they're working on the American release now. Or at least that was in August was the last Facebook post I saw about it. So hopefully it'll release in America soon. But if you're in the UK, you can go on Amazon or a couple other places and get it. So yeah,
definitely. All right. Well, this has been Zach and Dave review Hookah Hey, the film by again Monfils. What was his first name? Oh, I'm sorry. You're a great director. You directed a great film. I can't remember your name.
And story by Miriam Hashim.
Yes. And we give it 2 thumbs up, right? 2 thumbs up from us? Okay,
Yes.
great. 2 thumbs up from
I
Zach
think
and
that's
Dave.
copyrighted or something like that. So, you know, 2 thumbs up and a finger? I don't know. So anyway, something slightly different.
2 finger guns. 2 finger guns. I don't know.
That's also bad.
Oh, no. All right. Again, thanks for watching our review, and make sure to come back to the Around the Lens main show where you can see Zach, me, and others talk all about the world of visual journalism. This has been David J. Murphy for Zach Roberts, and we are out.